Okay, let's play some damn shit.
Reasonably well there. I applied and got into the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in their Assyriology program. So they mentioned studies
from China
and into the Egyptology, Assyriology, Hebrew Bible, and archaeology. And so I was an Assyriologist, so I took a lot of Hebrew Bible courses. And I got a full scholarship while I was there, and this other German scholarship to go study in Germany for a year to do my dissertation on the Sumerian texts, which is a whole other fun topic to talk about another time.
At what point in that process did something cause your ears to perk up and for you to kind of be like, China? This isn't quite what I was taught. Was there a moment
the whole entire
for you?
Yeah, actually, when I got to Hopkins,
all the Chinese scientists, all the Chinese
scholar, he was, I think, in his third year of the program.
Kill them all! Let God sort them.
And he said, "Oh, you evangelical?
Just as long as China can never be a threat to the United States of America,
what do you mean?
Militarily or by the internet, or anyway."
You got the wrong guy. The first semester, the first year, we had to take these history cycles, these history seminars. They were year-long seminars, and there were 3 of them. So the first was Syria-Palestine, the next one was the history of Mesopotamia, and then the next one was the history of Egypt. I started off with Syria-Palestine in the rotation, and every week I was coming in and going, that can't be right. Kyle
I ain't talking Josie Stalin either. I'm talking about Stalin.
Andrew, it was in that class with me, and he said, "How you doing? How you doing?" No, I'm okay. And then one week we were talking about the late Bronze Age collapse, and all the stuff that happened around 1200 BCE with the Sea Peoples, and so the Philistines show up.
That's a damn right.
And I remember halfway through that class, I remember what desk I was sitting at in what classroom. And I just sort of snapped. And because I was like, well, this is true. And then something's clearly wrong about this. And the way that I was raised, it's all interlocking.
Stupid! Kiss that
what specifically about the Philistines in the late Bronze Age collapse?
When they show up, like we know historically when they showed up.
And according to the Bible, it was significantly earlier.
Stupid machine!
Of course, as I'm sure you well know, apologetics that sort of try to engage with that.
Stupid idiot! Stupid idiot!
But people hear me say that and they go, "Oh gosh, it was just the Philistines, man." But it wasn't that. That was sort of the thing that was the moment. But at the same time that I'm learning all this history of Syria-Palestine,
don't even think about it.
I was taking a biblical archaeology course with Barry Gittman, and I was also taking Hebrew epigraphy, so we were reading all the old inscriptions. Of course, I was reading Sumerian and Akkadian literary texts, and all of these things together was just like this perfect storm. And I became an atheist really overnight. It felt like when I got that scholarship to go to Hopkins, I remember it was like the assistant dean of Capital Bible Seminary, or the dean, I can't remember, asked me, "Are you ready? Like, are you prepared to go into Johns Hopkins, a very liberal school?" And I held up my Hebrew Bible that I was carrying, and I said, "Well, I'm going into the Lion's Den. I'm going to win souls for Christ." And about halfway through my first semester, I deconverted. I had a friend that went to seminary with me that was coming up every Thursday to take me out to get some pizza, because Hopkins is a pretty stressful place your first year, and he was, of course, a very strong evangelical Christian. And when I deconverted, he very kindly walked around with me, talked to me, tried to keep me from going too far away from the faith, but he had a couple of battles.
Both of us grew up believing that the Bible was inspired by God, was perfect, and without error. But can you talk about a few of the contradictory and weirdly incoherent accounts in the Bible which led scholars to believe that it wasn't written by a single author, but was more of a mishmash of various contradicting sources? Specifically, I'm talking about the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible. Do they contain multiple contradictory accounts of the same events? Who wrote them? Was it a single author, Moses, or do we even know?
Yeah, big question. I mean, the first one is scholars have known that one person didn't write the Pentateuch now for several centuries. This is a discipline in field of biblical studies, looking at Pentateuchal studies, and just part of the formation of the Pentateuch is even a sub part of the field. So somebody like Joel
is an
excellent resource for anybody that really wants to do a deep dive into this. He wrote a book called On the Composition of the Pentateuch. Of course, he has lots of YouTube videos. He's done interviews. He's been on our channel. He looks in depth at the documentary hypothesis. And I guess I'll take a step back and talk about generally how this process took place for scholars who started to think, wait a minute, one guy didn't write this thing. Early on,
bitch, you suck,
I think, in Ezra, started to recognize things like, hey, the language here says things like on this side of the Jordan, or before there were kings in Israel,
or to this day.
To this day, that's
You
right.
suck,
So
man.
that sort of language gave away that at least those parts
suck,
are written later, because it's before there were kings in Israel. That means that the person must have been from the future when they knew there were going to be kings in Israel, or they're writing later, writing about that previous time. So then scholarship started to develop where they started noticing that there were literary inconsistencies. The story would kind of go along this way, and then all of a sudden it would shift and go a different direction, and then it would come back. There were these inconsistencies. There were contradictions. There were places where it looked like the same story was told two different times in almost the same way.
You suck, motherfucking
Probably the one that
You
I
suck,
use,
man.
again, Joel Bain uses it as sort of his linchpin examples, and he does such a good job of bringing it together for that. But in Genesis 37, you have the Joseph story. If you read it kind of quickly, like you and I both did, I'm sure growing up, you don't really see much of a problem there. So if you ask somebody, hey, what's the Joseph story? Well, you know, Joseph goes out with his brothers, he goes to check on them, and they throw him in a pit, and then these Midianites, Ishmaelites come and get him, and they sell him to this caravan of traders, and they go to take him down to Egypt and sell him. And that's how he gets down to Egypt and Potiphar's house, and all that stuff happens. But if you actually read through Genesis 37 closely, it's a very confusing chapter. If you just ask yourself the question, how did Joseph get down to Egypt? The text starts off by saying that the brothers are sitting there, and then Joseph's supposed to be in a pit, and then Ishmaelite caravan comes by, and then somehow Midianites pull him out of the pit, but then the brothers are selling Joseph, but then the text says that the Midianites sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, but then later it says that the Midianites sell Joseph to Egypt, and then later in chapter 39 it says the
Don't even think about you,
Ishmaelites.
slut.
For as long as, certainly back into rabbinical times, people have been wrestling with this and trying to figure out what it is. And so, like,
come
one
on,
of the
you
conclusions
slut.
is that, well, maybe the brothers sold him to the Midianites, who sold him to the Ishmaelites, who took him down to
Come on,
Egypt, sold him back to
slut.
the Midianites, who sold him to Potiphar, right? It's like, sure, that's possible. But if you break the story apart, and you keep all the Midianite stuff on this side, and it's obviously much more complex than that, but you sort of separate out the stuff that deals with the Midianites over here, and the stuff that talks about the Ishmaelites over here, scholars noticed, wait a second, there's two narratives here.
That by themselves,
Come on, you hooker.
they're consistent.
That's right, and they're coherent. And of course, the big place that you see this that everybody talks about is the flood account, back in starting in Genesis.
Come on, you
going
hooker.
through chapter 9, I think. So the text, if you read through it, it's weird. You're supposed to take
Move, you hooker.
You're supposed to take 7 pairs. Is the flood 40 days? Is it 150 days? What
Move,
day
hooker.
are planted? And all kinds of things that show up in the flood story that are just inconsistent with one another. But again, if you look at, and people have been doing this for a long time now, you can very clearly break the flood story apart into two different stories, two different narratives that have been ostensibly brought together in some way.
Yeah.
Through the Pentateuch, you can see these different narratives, these different threads that stand together, and they're all linked based on the story. And what they started to see is that, wait a minute, this particular thread talks a lot about the same types of things. Like this one is very concerned with things about priests, and uses a certain kind of language usually. But this one here uses a certain name for the god. This one calls him Yahweh, but this one over here calls him Elohim. And so what they started to do was notice that these different strands that were coherent formed their own narratives. And so a theory developed called the documentary hypothesis, where there were 4 separate sources, and they were called J, E, D, and P. J is for German Yahweh, because the name of the deity that's used there. E is for Elohim. D is for the Deuteronomist, makes most of the book of Deuteronomy, and P is for the priestly source. Again, if you want all the details on this, you can go read Joel Bain's book or any good introduction to the Hebrew Bible. And that theory holds solidly in many different parts. The consensus of scholarship is that there are different places and different sources that are brought together. There is a debate about whether you have major sources that were brought together, or do we have little fragments that were brought together into larger fragments, and those fragments were edited together and then later edited together a different way. But everybody agrees that it wasn't Moses. It wasn't this one guy named Moses that wrote this thing down. And it's not based on some anti-supernatural bias or something. It's based on the literary inconsistencies themselves.
Do we know when these were written?
Most scholars, and again, this is not my area of specialization, in the book that I wrote, I have a chapter on this, and I give the reader a nice solid bibliography that they can really dive into this stuff if they want. But most scholars would agree on certain aspects of when certain books were written, as far as in what order they appear in, generally speaking. But I'm probably ill qualified compared to those that actually specialize in this to talk about when specifically these were written. Certainly, you may have some early Hebrew poetry that may go back to like the 11th century. But most of the Hebrew Bible is being composed, 8th, 7th century later. It's not back in the late Bronze Age. It's not 1406 when this is being put together by Moses.
So this isn't being written down at the time the events are allegedly taking place by eyewitnesses. It's not by one author, it's not by Moses, it's by anonymous sources, and it's multiple sources kind of stitched together after the fact. What about the later stuff? Like once we get into the stories of Daniel talking about the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar, conquering Jerusalem, destroying the temple, taking people into Babylon to exile. What year approximately are the events that occur in Daniel? What year is that taking place? And was Daniel written in that time? Or are those other books that they also written later?
So Daniel's a fun one. This is supposed to be the time that Nebuchadnezzar takes over right at the end of the 7th century. So 605, 604 BCE. And it goes down through into the Persian period after the fall of the Babylonian Empire. That's when the events are supposed to have taken place. More conservative scholars, and there aren't many of them, would argue that this is like a 6th century, written in the 6th century document, right? Most evangelical scholars will say, yeah, 2nd century.
If it was written in that early date, that would be incredible because there's things that Daniel prophesies that come true that happened later. So how can we tell if these are accurate prophecies that are taking place, or if it's written after the fact, acting like it was written earlier and projecting those events onto the past?
Yeah, this is why Daniel is such a hot button issue. Because it's supposed to be written during this period in the Babylonian Empire and predicting all the way down to Greece, which is hundreds of years later. And so if that's the case, well, this is predictive prophecy, right? Particularly when you get toward the end of the book of Daniel, where it's a lot more detailed. It's pretty good. And so that's why this is such a big deal. We really want Daniel to be written early. So how do we know? How do we tell? There's linguistic evidence and there's historical evidence. From a linguistic side, if I were to pick up a piece of paper that said, what ho, who art thou, or something like that.
Wherefore art thou, Romeo?
Right, exactly. All things considered, all things being equal, we would say, okay, this is probably early. English has developed quite a bit since then. That doesn't mean that you couldn't write something trying to mimic that earlier grammar and speech patterns. However, if you said, wherefore art thou, dude, you might say, wait a minute. Or if in a period when the word show, S-H-O-W, was written S-H-E-W, if during that early period you're spelling it with a later spelling, that's sort of another giveaway. Wait a minute, something's a little off here. This sort of thing that we see, again, very roughly, showing up in the book of Daniel. So there are two languages primarily that show up in Daniel, Hebrew and Aramaic. We have some Greek, we have some Persian words, but it's basically Hebrew and Aramaic on the whole. There are people that specialize in Aramaic studies, people that specialize in Hebrew, obviously, particularly with respect to dating. There's a 2-volume set out on my shelf now that essentially gets pretty, it's like a 2016 publication, and it goes through in some detail what are the 4 different stages of biblical Hebrew and what are their diagnostic features. What is it that we see? So a certain verb has a certain meaning in a particular period, and that's early. Words change their meanings over time, even though it's the same word. But the same is true in other languages. So if you've got a word that's being used with a meaning that is clearly one that happens in later Hebrew texts and doesn't show up in earlier texts, that's an indication that it's later. Or certain letters, for example, in Aramaic, the letter Dalet and the letter Zayin. Zion is used earlier, the Z sound is used earlier in Aramaic text. But later Aramaic text, everywhere there was a Z, a Zion, it shifts to a D. And so if you see a document that's using that Dalet, the D letter, where there should be a Z, it's like, oh, that's sort of a feature of later Aramaic, not earlier. And so there are lots of different things that scholars look at and are meticulous about, and they count things, and they look at all the different Aramaic corpora that we have, and they say, okay, it's later than these, earlier than these, so it seems to fit right in this general area here. So Aramaic is, generally speaking, it seems like scholars say that it's, you can't really be terribly precise with it. It's a little bit earlier than what we see at Qumran, 2nd century maybe BCE.
In the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, that's right, the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it seems to be later than like the Elephantine papyri, later than the 5th century, but earlier than like the 2nd century, so sort of in that general area. With Hebrew, you can get a little more precise. You do it the same way. And for example, we see ani instead of the older anochi, malchut instead of mamlacha, and
this is boring!
Again,